Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 17, Section 5, African American Culture in the 1920s. Number one, what were some of the reasons that African Americans migrated from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North? And this really kind of goes back to the time of World War One. Many were seeking to escape, the segregation issues with the Jim Crow laws. A lot of them were coming north for economic opportunities and to build better lives. Cities like Chicago and Detroit heavily recruited African Americans to work in their factories. And number two, where did African Americans create an environment that stimulated artistic development, racial pride, and a sense of community and political organization? And that would be within the neighborhood of Harlem, which is in New York City. This would be an area that at one point in time was kind of where the upper crust of New York society once lived. If you go back to the time of like Alexander Hamilton, well, by the time we get to the beginnings of the 20th century, it's a neighborhood that is primarily a segregated neighborhood with apartments and businesses that are owned predominantly by African Americans. Not that there weren't whites that would go into this neighborhood to go to the different jazz clubs and such, but it was predominantly a segregated neighborhood. Number three, what were two striking characteristics of the Harlem Renaissance? Just to kind of recap, anytime that we talk about a renaissance, it's like a rebirth. And within this neighborhood of New York, Harlem, we had kind of a rebirth of the, creative arts. And so when you talk about it in terms of writing, this was an opportunity for writers to basically voice their proud defiance and their bitter contempt of racism. And number four, who was the most prolific, original, and versatile writers of the Harlem Renaissance? And that would be Langston Hughes. Hughes was a writer of prose, short stories, novels, maybe a little bit of poetry. And number five, who wrote the first major stories that featured African American writers as central characters? And that would be Zora Neale Hurston, who you see pictured below. Number six, who became the first great cornet slash trumpet soloist in jazz music? And that would be none other than the famous, there we go, Louis Armstrong. A lot of people probably know Louis Armstrong for a song that came out in the 1960s called It's a Wonderful World. But he was also very well known as a horn player during the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Who became known as the Empress of the Blues? And that would be a woman named Bessie Smith. Was notable about the musical Shuffle Along? It was the first musical written, produced, and performed by African Americans. Number nine, why did African American voters in northern cities usually vote Republican? Well, it has a lot to do with being the party of Abraham Lincoln. When we talk about in the Deep South, uh, typically the Democratic Party had been kind of in opposition to Lincoln and some of the ideals of the radical Republicans, kind of going back to the 1860s, 1870s, during the time of the war and also the Reconstruction. But Republicans, for the most part, that's kind of what they're known for, as being the party of Abraham Lincoln. And number 10, what did the NAACP's persistent efforts lead to in 1922? And it became basically associated with the first anti-lynching legislation that's going to go on the books. Anytime we talk about lynchings, typically they are murders that are ethnically and racially motivated. Um, for today, we'd probably label them as hate crimes. But there was a time in America where individuals who were lynched very rarely ever were prosecuted, or I should say, the people who committed these acts were very rarely prosecuted. So, having this type of legislation on the books actually means that it's possible that people who are the murderers in this case could actually stand trial. Granted, even though that we have this legislation on the books, it doesn't necessarily even the playing field for African Americans and other ethnicities who were um, consistently lynched in America. And number 11, what was Negro nationalism? If you remember, nationalism is kind of like this pride you have in your country or your people. This might help you understand this. This was actually a movement led by a man named Marcus Garvey. Garvey was originally from Jamaica, came to the United States as an African American, and one of the things that he wanted to do is to glorify African American culture and traditions and to get people proud of their heritage. Um, and at some point in time, he actually spearheaded a movement to recolonize the continent of Africa with American Africans, African Americans. Didn't get very far, but at the same time, if you would look worldwide, there were many different nationalist movements kind of happening. What were two levels of Marcus Garvey's message to African Americans? First was that African Americans could gain economic, and then the second is political power, primarily through education. In number 13, what did Garvey propose to his followers in 1920? Again, he wanted to lead them back to Africa to basically resettle the African coast. There were some people that actually did go back, but it was not necessarily one that caught on. And that kind of leads us to number 14. Who distanced themselves from Garvey and his message? And it was primarily the emerging African American middle class and intellectuals. They didn't necessarily buy into this idea of going back to Africa. And number 15, when did Marcus Garvey's sense of racial pride and hope for the future reemerged? This would come back during the 1950s and 60s when we get into what we kind of refer to as the civil rights movement in American history. All right, thank you very much.